We're on to part 4 of our sermon series on the Unitarian Universalist 7 principles, affirming and promoting a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Now, there are many Unitarian Universalists out there who have persuasively argued that the fourth may just be the most important of all of our principles, that it is the essential tenet which defines us as a unique people of faith. Maybe. I will concede that the primacy or the centrality of the fourth principle is a compelling argument. The principle begins with a value of deep historical significance to us, especially freedom, and specifically freedom of belief. As a creedless tradition, we do not require anyone to make a confession of faith regarding the nature of the divine. Rather, we encourage each individual to come to their own conclusions about such matters, conclusions derived from each individual's free and responsible search for ultimate truth and ultimate meaning. It's a great idea. No one should be coerced into accepting as true any statements from a creed. But in America in 2017, how significant is that UU freedom? Is our freedom any more free than anybody else's? Now, before we get ahead of ourselves, let's go backwards in time for a moment and examine why freedom of belief has been so important to our faith historically. Now, Unitarian Universalism is the present-day incarnation of two theological streams of faith that both flowed out of early Christianity, which of course itself flowed out of Judaism. Both Unitarianism and Universalism were labeled as heretical by the orthodoxy of the day. Unitarian Christians were anti-Trinitarians. That is, they did not believe in a triune God composed of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Rather, they conceived of God as a unity. This was a heresy. Universalist Christians believed that the love of God was so great that every human being, every child of God, would eventually be redeemed back to God in the end. So in other words, for Universalists, eternal damnation in hell did not exist. That was a super heresy. So for centuries, like all heretics and religious minorities everywhere throughout all time, Unitarian Christians and Universalist Christians were persecuted. They were cast out or forced underground, and some were even martyred. So perhaps it makes intuitive sense why present-day UUs would value freedom of belief so much. Our forebears were persecuted for centuries for believing the wrong thing. Then again, everybody's theological forebears at one point or another were persecuted. Even early Catholics were fed to the lions by the Romans. So if everybody's religious ancestors were persecuted, even those from religions that eventually became the dominant majority, shouldn't we all value freedom of belief? Because for the most part, nobody wants to see anybody else needlessly persecuted. Now, basically, I would say that this sentiment indeed found its way into the First Amendment of our U.S. Constitution. And some form of freedom of religion has been more or less adopted by pretty much everyone in the Western world. Let's say, for example, tomorrow that I have an epiphany, a vision in which the Prophet Muhammad speaks to me. There's absolutely nothing stopping me from converting to Islam. I have the legal freedom to do that in this country. And if after being a Muslim for several years, I begin doing some serious reflection and come to realize that all life is suffering, and that all suffering comes from desire, and that suffering and desire can be eliminated by following an eightfold path, well, then I have the freedom to convert to Buddhism. And if after living as a Buddhist for a while, I hear on the radio a really compelling argument for the existence of a triune God, 1/3 of which died for my sins on a cross, and that this God believes that all things should be done decently and in order, then there's nothing stopping me from becoming a Presbyterian. The United States of America recognizes my right to search for ultimate truth and meaning, and that's what allows me to move from religion to religion, denomination to denomination, congregation to congregation, in order to voluntarily surround myself with people who have reached the same speculative metaphysical conclusions about the nature of the divine that I have reached. What separates us from other faith traditions is that in most other religions, if your individual search for truth and meaning leads you to new and different conclusions that do not happen to sync with the creed of your religious community, likely you will be asked to leave. If you're a conservative Baptist, and one day you decide that Jesus isn't divine after all, and that Muhammad is in fact the last great prophet of Allah, there's a good chance that your Baptist brothers and sisters are going to ask you to leave. And that is not necessarily a terrible thing. In all honesty, it truly might be in everyone's best interests. The Baptist fellowship would be able to continue to worship their God peacefully in their established manner. And the hypothetical former Baptist would probably benefit greatly by joining a community of Muslims in order to learn more about the traditions and practices of those who follow the teachings of Muhammad. So there's nothing wrong with this situation at all. It's quite normal and possibly very healthy for everyone involved. But we Unitarian Universalists, we would not ask someone to leave simply because they came to a new or a novel or a different conclusion about the nature of God. I guess the point I'm driving to is this. It's not so much that UUs value freedom of belief any more or any less than Baptists or Muslims or anyone else. We're just willing to let you still be a part of the community if in your freedom you choose to believe something different from the rest of us. We UUs make the conscious decision to be a community of people who have come to vastly different conclusions about the nature of God. So this would suggest two things. One, Unitarian Universalists truly do value inclusivity, theological diversity, and pluralism. In other words, we believe that being in community and worshiping with people of very different beliefs is a good thing and something that we each want to be a part of. And or point two, we UUs generally don't think that conclusions we draw about the divine are of utmost importance. That is, the individual conclusions we draw about the supernatural, if it even exists, is not nearly as important to us collectively as the conclusions we each draw about how we are going to live and act in the here and now. So to reiterate, I would argue that the so-called freedom found in our fourth principle isn't necessarily broader, more novel, or any freer than any other faith's freedom. But what it truly represents about our faith is our collective desire for inclusivity, diversity, pluralism, and the value that we all place on making a difference in this world. And I think that that reading of freedom in the fourth principle bodes well for the future of our faith, because I don't think that freedom, and particularly freedom of belief, is the most pressing value facing most young people in this country today. We know that the reach and the power of the church has been declining in the West for decades. Globalization and multiculturalism have been broadening our religious horizons for some time. Mainline Christianity has liberalized and become less dogmatic over time. We are becoming an increasingly secular nation. All that means that fewer young people today feel coerced into a religious system as compared to generations past, which suggests to me that the freedom of belief represented by our fourth principle will actually continue to become less and less important, or at least less central to the thinking of successive generations of UUs. And actually, I might make the argument that that is already the case today. Anecdotally, I can tell you that when I talk about UUism with older folks, I often hear something like freedom of belief as a primary draw. However, when I talk to younger UUs, I often hear their primary attraction to our faith is our commitment to celebrating diversity, which, as I hopefully just pointed out, I think are actually two sides of the exact same coin. I think it might be fair to say then, speaking in maybe overly broad generalities, that in looking at our fourth principle, older UUs consider the word free to be the most important descriptor of our search for truth and meaning, whereas younger UUs are naturally more drawn to the word responsible. That is, younger Unitarian Universalists seem more naturally inclined to value a search for truth and meaning that is done authentically, in good faith, and with an eye on how each person's individual search affects others. For example, Gen Xers and millennial UUs in their search for truth and meaning often will be more attentive to notions of religious and cultural appropriation as they craft their personal theologies and personal spiritual practices as compared to boomer UUs. Moreover, younger UUs will likely be less forgiving of religious beliefs and practices that perpetuate conscious or unconscious forms of oppression. I personally appreciate this emphasis on the word responsible as it appears in our fourth principle. It's a very important delimiter. As we discussed last week, no freedom, whether freedom of speech or of religious belief, no freedom is ever absolute. And our UU freedom to search for truth and meaning is no different. Just because we are creedless, that does not mean that we UUs can believe whatever we want. Let me say that again. Just because we are creedless, that does not mean that we can believe whatever we want. Now that said, the line between a responsible search for truth and meaning and an irresponsible search is indeed a fuzzy one, and I am not entirely sure who gets to decide where to draw it. Now at the extremes, at the poles, it's quite easy. For example, if someone says, hey, after a lot of thought and contemplation, I've come to realize that I don't believe in any kind of God. I think the universe exists and coheres by wholly natural processes. I think we would all agree that such a conclusion was likely the result of an individual's earnest and responsible search for truth and meaning. Likewise, if someone said, I've given it a lot of thought, and I simply can't imagine, I can't fathom how this universe came to be without some external, supernatural force guiding it, and I'm comfortable calling that force of life God. I think, again, we could all agree that this conclusion was the product of a responsible search for truth and meaning conducted in good faith. On the other hand, for an example of a clearly irresponsible search, I'll share with y'all an article from The Onion. The Onion, of course, is a satirical publication, but God knows there's truth in satire. This particular article from The Onion examines a so-called new religion known as fictionology. Here's an example describing this fake religion. Created in 2003 by self-proclaimed Messiah Bud Don Elroy, fictionology's principles were first outlined in the self-help paperback Imaginetics, the new pipe dream of modern mental make-believe. Fictionology's central belief that any imaginary construct can be incorporated into the church's ever-growing set of official doctrines continues to gain popularity. Believers in Santa Claus, his elves, or the Tooth Fairy are permitted, even encouraged, people are encouraged to view them as deities. Even corporate mascots like the Kool-Aid Man are valid objects of fictionology worship. My personal savior is Batman, said Beverly Hills plastic surgeon Greg Jurgensen. My wife chooses to follow the teachings of the Gilmore Girls. Of course, we are still beginners. Some advanced-level fictionologists have total knowledge of every lifetime they have ever lived for the past 80 trillion years. Sure, it's total BS, Jurgensen added, but that's fictionology. Praise Batman. Funny, right? Well, sure it is. Unless you happen to be a Unitarian Universalist minister, in which case, after reading this article, you may be afflicted by waking nightmares in which a new guest signs our membership book and then promptly raises his hands to the heavens and shouts, "Praise Batman." Thankfully, in my 4 or 5 years here, that has only happened once. It was Thomas Karst. The point is, this fictitious religion in this fake news article, it's an obvious example of an alleged search for truth and meaning that was not done in good faith. And therefore, it was not a responsible search. But in real life, where do we draw the lines? That is a very hard question. Indeed, our fourth principle raises many hard questions because there are so many powerful words within it that are so hard to define. Here's another hard question, a question you may recall was posed in the most famous trial in all of human history. What is truth? 2,000 years ago, maybe, Pontius Pilate asks this question to Jesus of Nazareth. If we choose to read this text through the lens of Orthodox Christianity, which I think is wholly appropriate considering this story belongs to Christians, here's then what happens. Man, humankind, puts God on trial for a capital offense, mind you. Humankind wants to kill God. Now, most of us know this story, so we know how it ends, but for those who may not, spoiler alert, we do it. We, humans, convict God. We find him guilty, and then we kill him. But before that happens, in the midst of the trial, humanity asks God this amazingly important question: what is truth? And God does not answer. Philosophers have been asking this question, studying truth as a concept for millennia. It is a dizzyingly complex idea. Is truth absolute or relative? Is it objective or subjective? What is truth's relationship to language, to empirical observation versus purely rational a priori concepts? Does truth even exist? If so, epistemologically speaking, how could we ever be certain? For that matter, how can we be certain of anything? So, what is truth? Look, if God can't or won't answer that question, don't expect me to answer it for you either. But I can and will say this. In my very short years living on this planet, I have personally found that when it comes to the day-to-day living, trying to understand what is truth is not nearly as important as being true. That is, living honestly and authentically with one another and with ourselves. Honesty is rapidly going extinct. We are living in a post-truth world of alternative facts. And I think that we are right to fiercely resist this trend. I believe our faith calls us to do so. But I will also note that humans have bemoaned the death of honesty for some time, as our Message for All Ages today pointed out. The ancient Greek philosopher Diogenes of the Cynic school was scouring the countryside by day, holding a lantern in search of an honest man whom he never found. The more things change. As important as it is to be honest and true in our interactions with others, it is perhaps even more important, as Polonius would tell us, to be true to ourselves. Being true to oneself requires having the courage to step away from lies and falsehoods that we have willingly accepted in order to avoid feeling bad about ourselves and to thus avoid having to change the way we live our lives. At some point or another, we have all been guilty of having accepted beautiful lies that kept us from facing our own shadows. The final hard question suggested by our fourth principle: what does this all mean? What is the meaning of life? We've all got our answers, don't we? I actually gave mine about a year or so ago in a sermon in which I extrapolated an idea from French linguist Roland Barthes, the idea that the author is dead. I theologized Barthes' answer to make the argument that even if a God exists, he or she can only rightfully be thought of as the writer of creation, not the author of creation. And as such, there is no authoritative meaning to anything. It was a real heartwarmer, that sermon. Everyone was filled with immense hope afterwards. If you're interested in a more in-depth look at my bleakly existentialist ideas, you can find that sermon on our YouTube channel. The title was Textual Healing. But today, in the few remaining minutes I have, I'm going to answer this question from a slightly different angle. What is the meaning of life, you ask? I will answer your question with a question. What is the meaning of this cup? Now, the question should strike you as odd. It doesn't quite make sense. It doesn't fit right. It's slightly but significantly the wrong question. I humbly suggest that to ask what the meaning of life is slightly but significantly the wrong question to ask. I would suggest that life, existence, has about as much meaning as this cup. There is a subtle but important difference between asking what something means and what something is for. What is its purpose? What is its function? What, as Aristotle would call it, is its telos? In other words, what can I do with this thing? Now that's a question that I can apply to both this cup and to life. And serendipitously, I believe the answer is exactly the same. Allow me to demonstrate. The answer is drink from it. Drink deeply. Drink to the lees. One of my favorite quotes from Albert Camus goes like this: "You will never be happy if you continue to search for what happiness consists of. You will never live if you are looking for the meaning of life." So excelsior to you, intrepid UU sojourners, on your quests, your free yet responsible searches for ultimate truths and ultimate meanings. But in your pursuit, in the spirit of Camus, I remind you, don't forget to live, to drink deeply and fully from the cup of life with the time that you have been blessed with. Blessed be.